You have claimed that you oppose medical transitioning for these children, namely and specifically to what normally happens is puberty blockers, which you have called you called it child abuse. Is that
It
correct?
is. That's correct.
You consider it okay. You consider it child abuse. You consider it child abuse because you believe that a child is not capable of consenting to what you consider are irreversible procedures. Is that correct?
A damaging, irreversible procedure.
Damaging. Okay. Ben, are your children circumcised? Did you circumcise your children?
Yes, I have two sons and they're both circumcised.
Why would you do that? Isn't that kind of hypocritical?
Nope, I'm circumcised. My works just fine.
So I've long wondered when a moment like this has happened, and maybe it's happened other times that I just haven't noticed. And the reason that I've wondered that is because Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh and a lot of the people at his organization and a lot of conservatives in general have long started marshaling all of these arguments against the sexual transition of minors, right? Most of them, I'm sure, probably don't like transsexuals in general, but they don't seem to be making strong arguments against adults having it done. Now, they don't want to address adults by the preferred pronouns, and I totally understand. You want to have free speech. You should be able to not be forced to use a certain term. I certainly don't disagree with that. But it seems like they've kind of intuitively understood that a consenting adult can decide to do something. And so if they want to have a sex change surgery when they're of legal age or of sound mind, then that's something that's not a hill that they're really going to die on. But they really have kind of zeroed in on the surgery of minors. And I think that makes perfect logical sense. That makes a lot of sense ethically and principally. And I don't disagree with them. I think that if you are not capable of making decisions, if you're not capable of understanding the consequences of what's happening, then doing something that is irreversible, even if it's damaging or not damaging, and we can get into the definition of what it is not damaging, is something that probably shouldn't be done, and raises a ton of questions. Also, when people are younger, they could be very well under the influence of others, and I think it's not so far-fetched. And I think I've even heard Ben and Matt Walsh talk about, we have cases of very young children whose parents are claiming that they're transgender and kind of dressing them a certain way and making them act a certain way. And you get this sense, at least in some cases, I wouldn't say in all, but in some cases, it definitely seems like the parents are using the children to virtue signal. And a small enough child, once they get to be teenagers, sometimes you get that rebellious phase and you can have younger people able to resist. But when they're very young, they don't have that ability. And so you have a case where parents are making irreconcilable, unchangeable, lifelong decisions for their children, and the child is too young and too developmentally premature to resist or to decide differently, and they just kind of play along with it. And so these are all perfectly valid points and good points when it comes to child transition. I don't disagree by and large. But then the logic that they're invoking seems quite clearly on the face of it to also condemn things like infant circumcision, right? If you can't cut, and I've heard them say things as specific as cut away healthy tissue, not consensual permanent surgeries. Okay, circumcision falls under all of those categories, right? It's a surgery. It removes healthy tissue. That tissue can never be replaced. There are things you can do. Obviously, you can do restoration, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But even if that was 100% effective, which it's not, why would you be imposing that on somebody, right? So this is a very logical question to ask anyone who is so adamantly against infant or child sex changes, and the same ethical questions that they would raise for that. By and large, there's some nuance where there are some distinctions, but in principle, they're very, very similar. There could be differences in degree, but not so much in principle. And so I don't know, maybe there are other examples of this having happened. There was a almost debate about circumcision between Ben Shapiro and was it the Yang character? he had said that he was against circumcision. He was on Ben's show, and they just said, we're not going to talk about it, kind of laughed it off. So maybe this stuff has happened before. I've just never seen the clips. But let's continue. Well, so he now qualifies that you can't do something that's quote unquote damaging. Now, part of the problem here is that there's an entire medical establishment now is officially saying that transitioning is not damaging, that it's healthcare. This is kind of the new buzzword, that it's healthcare. That if you're denying sexual transition to a minor, that you're denying healthcare. And this, although this is controversial in the sense that there are physicians who don't agree with this, there's pediatricians who don't agree with this, there's a lot of philosophers who don't agree with this, but the main associations and institutions have been captured by people and by groups who are inclined, whatever their true feelings are, to endorse this as healthcare. And so they're going to say that castrating and giving sex hormones and amputating, mastectomies, all these things to minors is not damaging. And Ben is also now going to say, in the defense of his irreversible minor surgery of choice, that it's not damaging. So let's continue.
Why is violating the bodily autonomy of an infant acceptable to you? And I can say, I'm a owner, and I can tell you, there's sensitivity right there, Ben, that is removed when you do a circumcision. Why is that okay to
well,
you?
I don't mean to get personal, but I'm sure it doesn't seem like you could possibly have a basis for comparison.
So this is something valid to say. It's an observation that's valid in the sense that, like, how could you know? But by this definition, then, something's not damaging or is okay or unquestionable if the victim or the person who it's done to is then unable to assess what has happened, right? And there's this brings up a whole host of things that you say, well, if we were to do this to somebody, to a child, we do it to them early enough, and by it I mean almost anything, and then they grow up having no point of reference, right? We could blind a child, for instance. You could gouge out their eyes when they're very young, and by the time they're older, they will have no memory of having had sight, and presumably also they would still be able to have children, so therefore it's not damaging because they have no point of comparison, right? That seems to be the logic that he's invoking here. He's going to invoke another point later that is similarly kind of begs so many questions. But this seems to be the qualification, that we're going to insert this variable of damaging, and then we're going to say that, well, transition is damaging, even though medical authorities are saying that it's not. And, I would argue that the medical authorities that say that, by the way, are captured and that they're wrong, and that it is very damaging to do a sexual transition to a minor. It's very damaging even to do it to an adult, but an adult is in a position to decide that they want that anyway, that they'll take the risk, that they'll take the harm, that they'll take the damage. They want to do it, they can decide. And, there's, as many of you know, like, there's a good question of, like, when is that allowable? When do you have that debate? I think it's perfectly fine to raise questions about, well, when is somebody old enough to consent to something like that? It might not be 18. It might be later than 18. It might be before 18. But that's a question you can have. It's not really pertinent in this case, just to say that there's a point before which it's not possible. There's a point after which, when it is, without having to get into the specifics of when exactly that is. But this damaging, not damaging, and what we call damaging, we'll get into that because that's an interesting question.
You can't be both circumcised and uncircumcised. You're going to have to choose. As far as the efficacy of a once it's circumcised, if you wish to get into the biology, I'm perfectly happy to just point at my 4 children. I've been fruitful and I've multiplied. It's all working out just great.
Okay, so this is interesting. So apparently the fact that Ben Shapiro has successfully had children means that he is fruitful, he's multiplied, and so therefore he's not damaged. But that is not the definition of damage. Again, there's many things that we could do to you and you could still have children, right? We could gouge out your eyes, we could break your hand, we could amputate fingers, we could amputate ears, we could amputate one of your testicles, right? A woman could have a double mastectomy and she could probably still bear children. If someone knows different than that, let me know, but I think that would be true. If not, then you could chop off a child's nipples, you could flail part of their nose. Right, these are all things that you could do, and you could still multiply. And in fact, I want to pull up here, just for reference, the other elephant in the room here is this would also apply to female circumcision. Now, advocates of male circumcision are loath to make the comparison. They for some reason, want to say that they're completely different to the point where they don't even want to refer to it as female circumcision. They like to call it FGM, female genital mutilation, because they just don't want there to be any association there. But female circumcision is very common in the Muslim world. I was just looking up the stats. So you won't be able to see this, but it's not hard to find. In Egypt, the circumcision rate for women is about 75 to 85% of married women have female circumcision, FGM. And the birth rate in Egypt is higher than the birth rate in the United States, is higher than the birth rate in Israel. So and not only that, if it's done when they're young, and female circumcision, one of the things that makes it a little bit more tricky as a comparison is there's more variance in female circumcision. There are forms of female circumcision that are absolutely more invasive and more destructive than the standard versions of male circumcision. But there's also versions that are less invasive, right? So in the United States, when female circumcision was banned in 1996, the plaintiffs in that kind of brought this about, the people who are doing it and who led to suit, this has been challenged in court, by the way. The law was overturned in the United States, I think maybe 2 years ago. Their form of female circumcision is a ceremonial, quote, pinprick, where they would draw a single drop of blood. They would remove no tissue. There would be no scar. The damage would be so minimal that a pediatrician examining the girl days or weeks later would not even be able to establish that it had happened. Right now, you could say, and I could even agree, that, well, even that is wrong. It shouldn't be done. But what you can't say is that is more invasive than male circumcision. Male circumcision is much more involved than that. Now, there's other forms of female genital mutilation, female circumcision, that are more advanced, that require more. And there's other layers of variables. You could say, having it done by a doctor versus having it done by a tribal elder with a rusty knife in a dung hut. That just raises all these other questions about the safety of the medical procedure. Of course, there's male circumcision that also happens under those circumstances, including not totally impertinently, of Hasidic Jews in the United States using their fingernails to peel the foreskin off of a baby and then putting their mouth on the exposed, damaged penis that's bleeding, which Ben would say is not damaged, but if it's not damaged, where's all the blood coming from? And if it's not damaged, where did the foreskin go? Is just healed into bliss, or it was removed by the fingernail of a mohel, who's now putting his adult lips on the baby? By the way, in Israel today, if you ask for a blowjob, you ask for a mepitza b'peh, and a mepitza b'peh is the term of that part of the circumcision ritual. So they literally call blowjobs a circumcision ritual. It's the same term. And there have been cases, many cases actually, of Hasidic baby boy Jews getting herpes, getting other STDs from their mohel, putting their lips on the penis. And so, there's so many problems with this. But yes, you can be circumcised as a man and still have children. But he didn't say this, and you can say, did this guy say things right or whatever? It's not the best position for him to be in. They hustle him off right here, right? It's not the best format to have a debate, for sure. But he didn't say it makes you so that you can't have children. He didn't say that it makes it so that you're infertile. He says it does that. It's violating their bodily autonomy. And Ben is saying, well, you can do it as long as you don't damage them, and I'm not damaged because I have kids. I have fruitful. My dick, quote, works just fine. But that wasn't the argument. Yes, you can still have children. Women who are circumcised can still have children. So, like, that's not the standard. You don't say that because you can still reproduce, you haven't been damaged, right? Again, you could be blinded. You could have your hands broken. You could have your feet removed. There's a lot that we could do to you. And also, this point of like, hey, you don't have a point of comparison. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about. We do have people who have points of comparison. We have people who get circumcised in adulthood who have experience either being sexually active or at least self-sexually active. And you have people who restore your foreskins. Now, restored foreskins are not, in general, going to be as good. I think everyone agrees on that. But they're going to put you down that spectrum. And if you ask those people, there's two things. If you ask men who restore, you would be very, very hard-pressed to find a single example of somebody saying it's not better restored than it is circumcised. And on the understanding that a restored penis is not even as good as a intact penis, as an uncircumcised penis is. I mean, we don't know the exact numbers. The estimates I've always read, I think these are a little bit low, is that there's something like 250,000 restorers in the United States. There could be more, there could be less, but we're talking about many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Potentially more, but that's, it's probably in that ballpark. You would be very hard-pressed to find any who would say that it's not better that way. So for him to say you don't have a point of comparison, well, we do have people who could say, now, fair point is to argue, well, that's a very biased substandard. You're taking the guys who have made the decision to restore. That's an unusual group for whatever reason. It's just statistically not common. I mean, people do it from all parts of life and whatnot, but absolutely true. There is a selection bias in that cohort for sure. But even so, you're going to get about 100% or 99.99% saying it's better to be restored than it is to be circumcised. You can also have people who are circumcised as adults. Now, there, the testimonies are much more mixed. You will have guys who have been circumcised as adults who say it's fine and they don't notice any difference. You'll have some people who say it feels better. You'll have some people who say they can't really tell. There's lots of problems in that group as too, because you have the same selection bias. If they're getting circumcised as an adult, it's either because, in most cases, it's either because they have some kind of medical problem that makes circumcision more necessary than it generally is. There are situations that can exist where circumcision is something that might be called for. It's far overprescribed. People are getting told that they need to be circumcised for minimal things that don't require that, but there are cases where it's plausibly something that could be done. It's almost always more invasive than necessary, but plausibly could be done. Or you have people for psychological reasons who feel ashamed, or for religious reasons or aesthetic reasons. Occasionally I hear of people who just think that they look better. That's fine, and as an adult, I'm not going to question somebody wanting to do that. But then their testimony about what feels good or doesn't feel good is not going to be pure. It's the only pure examples would be people who got circumcised as adults accidentally or inadvertently. For instance, if somebody was in a car accident or if somebody was just straight up accidentally circumcised, not that that would be a huge lawsuit. I would be curious what Ben would even say in that situation. Let's say that you went in for another procedure and there was a mix-up, or you had an overzealous mohel who was a doctor, and they just decide to circumcise you when you're under, right? And I have met people who have experienced jokes to that effect. I had a friend who was uncircumcised and had a buildup of fluid, like saline fluid in his scrotum at some point when he was in college. He went in to have that removed. Apparently it was not fairly normal, but fairly common. And as they were putting him under, he'd already been drugged. As he was starting to pass out, the doctor said, "Oh, by the way, do you want us to circumcise you as well?" And before he could even reply, he passed out. Now, as it happened, they didn't do it. It sounded like it was a joke, but like it's not impossible to imagine it happening in that case. There's definitely cases of it happening accidentally to children. There are cases of parents who do not want their child circumcised, and the hospitals do it anyway. In fact, the most famous cases are actually Jewish children who are going to get circumcised, but the family wants them to be circumcised in the ritual. They want to have a ritual circumcision, right? Because just getting circumcised is not enough. In the Jewish religious mandates, you can't just get a cut. You have to have a mohel. You have to have a ceremony. There's a chair and blood and family, blah, blah, blah. And there are cases where hospitals have just done it and the families have sued. And I wonder what Ben would say, that that's fine. They're not damaging you. You can still have kids. So it's like it didn't happen. But again, to get on a tangent, but like the point is that, but many people also who get circumcised as adults say that they see a massive loss in pleasure. You'll get, and so he's going to just dismiss this guy and say, because you can't compare, you can't have an opinion. Of course, Ben can't compare either, but he can have a very strong opinion that his dick, quote, works just fine. Well, a normal penis that's not circumcised, for instance, will achieve orgasm by typically enveloping the head in and out of the skin tube, right? Of the extra skin, the foreskin, the prepuce will glide on and off the head of the penis. And this will happen when you jerk off, and this will happen when you have sex. And this feels really, really, really good. And his penis, I presume, cannot do that. Now, he doesn't remember that, so he feels fine, but that function is gone. So he's not damaged. He had kids, but he doesn't even know what that function is. It's just completely gone from him. But yeah, so we have, I've met multiple people who got circumcised in adults who say it was the worst thing that ever happened to them, that they lost all of their sensitivity, 100%, 80%, 95%. Multiple guys have told me, I quote, feel nothing. These are people who are circumcised as adults or as late teens, but had experiences up to that point where they were able to tell. And I've even gone to the point of interviewing a guy who got circumcised as an adult and then restored all as an adult. You can see that interview. I think it's called Cut, Uncut, Restored, One Man's Journey, something like that. It's maybe 6 or 7 years old at this point. I'm wearing a really awesome sweater in that interview. But if you look at these testimonies, bearing in mind that there's a selection bias in all cases, what makes more sense? The people saying that, well, the sensitive tissue has been removed and I feel a loss of sensitivity, or the people who say I don't notice anything? And even if you want to accept that those are honest, whatever their selection bias issues, sincere reportings that they don't feel a difference, you have to acknowledge that there's a chance that they do. And here's the other interesting thing. Circumcisions entail a lot of risk of something going wrong. There are botches. And the thing is, a baby does not report a botch because they can't report anything and they don't know anything. And so they just grow up with a skin bridge or a scar that's 2/3 or halfway down the shaft. I've definitely seen, skin bridges are not that rare. I've encountered more than a dozen people who've had them that, and these are just the people that you'll see naked. There's plenty of people that I'm sure I walk past on the street who had them. I've seen people with massive damage to their gland. I remember one guy had been eviscerated down the urethra. His urethra had been cut open, and so it flared from a circumcision. And even Ben and Matt will talk about this very, very famous case of the weird, crazy, creepy John Money who did a sex experiment. They had twins, and they sex transitioned one of them to be a girl. His name was Bruce, I think. And they'll tell that story. They'll repeat that story a lot, especially in this context of these sexual transitions of minors. And what they'll mention, but he's not going to mention it here, he's forgetting this part of the story. The reason that even happened is because Bruce had a botched circumcision, right? So the parents didn't take him in and say, we want to do a freaky experiment where we, castrate our son and make him pretend to be a girl. They went in for a circumcision and they botched it, which we don't have good data on this because it's not studied and it's not reported because the babies that have it done don't report. But we know that the botch rate is not trivial. His dick didn't work just fine. It got horribly circumcised to the point that the parents agreed. It must have been really bad if the parent, like if he'd just been cut a little tight, I doubt the parents would have said, yeah, let's go ahead and just transition him to a girl and cut his balls off. But that sort of thing happens regularly, and even so, that's a risk. You're imposing that risk on your children. And again, it's very interesting that he kind of thinks, it seems like, if you don't know the difference, then it's not damage. And I just would, again, that begs so many questions. Would that not also make female circumcision okay? Because they don't know the difference. Just like Ben is going to say, my dick works just fine, we can roll up woman after woman after woman after woman after woman who will say, I got circumcised as a woman. I'm fine. I don't mind. I can have kids. The birth rate in Egypt or any of these other Muslim countries is higher than it is in Israel or the United States. And I mean, you can even find examples of women who get, like American women who get circumcised in adulthood who say it's fine. There's a famous, I forget her name, she's in the American Circumcision documentary where her family kind of pushed her to do it when she was in college. And she's like, it's fine, I don't mind. And what's interesting is if Ben were to be shown that testimony, he would say, they're just blinded by their culture. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm telling them, of course, and their religion. But then so their anecdotes don't mean anything. Just like this guy's anecdote, it's kind of cluttered, but he basically says he's uncircumcised and there's a lot of sensitivity down there. And Ben is saying, your anecdote doesn't mean anything. My anecdote means everything, even though by his own logic, he has no point of reference. And then that begs the question, okay, so if they don't have a point of reference, then it's okay. But by this logic, you could sexually transition somebody, and if you do it when they're young enough, they won't even know that they were ever a boy or that it's not weird. And it's especially insidious if you were to do it to enough people in society that they wouldn't immediately be seen as strange, right? So if you sexually transition somebody as a baby, they're going to notice as they grow up at some point, unless you're able to completely sequester them, that, hey, something's different about them, whatever it is. And so that's going to raise a lot of questions, and that's going to be uncomfortable and could cause a lot of problems. Now, if you do something that's very common, say circumcising 75, 85, 90% of the boys, and they all grow up and it's just normal, then they're far less likely to raise an issue, just like most women in countries that practice female circumcision don't come out. And they could point out there's some famous women out there who are victims of female circumcision who speak out against it. Ayaan Hirsi Ali comes straight to mind. And you will have, I remember like when Sam Harris would interview he would even include that in her bio, like she's a victim of FGM. Okay. But it's only a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of women who speak out. Just like there's a tiny, tiny minority of men who speak out against circumcision. Of course, the number of men who speak out is actually more than a tiny minority. There's a decently sized anti-circumcision movement, at least in terms of sentiment. And many of them are not even men. They're women or men who weren't circumcised themselves, like this gentleman here. But you could just say, well, they're just a minority. They don't matter. But then Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she's just a minority too, and she doesn't matter. And by the way, what does Ayaan Hirsi Ali say about male circumcision? That it's fine and that it's totally different and that apples and oranges? No, she thinks that they're both wrong. Right? So it's funny how they can cherry pick and just decide, this anecdote means everything. My anecdote of being a guy, and here's the logic. By Ben's logic here, this guy could be completely right, and it could be a fact that circumcision removes, let's say, 95% of the sexual pleasure. Let's just say that's that, because by Ben's logic, that would not matter, because you would have no point of comparison. You could still have children. So even if that accusation is true, Ben would be for circumcision. And just think about that. And how many other things would he apply that to? So yes, are there differences in degree? Is it exactly analogous to transitioning a child? No, it's not. There are differences. It can be a lot more involved when you're doing a sexual transition. There's a lot of added things to this. But mutilating a penis, there's other things that we could cut off. There's other things that are much more minor than a circumcision that Ben would be absolutely against. Like if I said I had a religious proclivity to remove earlobes because I think they look ugly, I want to impose that on my child, right? He does not agree with parents imposing their woke virtue signaling about transgender rights onto their children, and rightfully so. But if they want to impose their religion, in his case, his 3,000-year-old, Bronze Age religion on his son. And what is he going to say on the chance, and there is a chance that at some point his son's going to grow up and say, hey, this is wrong. I don't agree with this. You should not have done this. And what's he going to say? Tough, as my child, you're my property. I didn't damage you. And again, if you were to just go and start doing, like, it's such a ridiculous analogy, or not analogy, but when you play it out in your head, if Ben or somebody else, if we just had this mass shooting in Maine, so we're not going to do a gun control video, but let's say instead of that, it was a mass circumcising, that some crazy Jewish guy broke out with a knife and started running around a playground, and he wasn't killing the kids, he was just chopping off their foreskins. Ben would be like, look, there's no damage. It's not. He's really doing them a favor because they won't get any cooties down there. Foreskin's icky. By the way, I have no comparison. That's the other thing. I don't know anything about foreskin because I don't have one. I don't want to know anything about foreskin, but I also know that it's icky and gross and that it's justified to remove it. How could you know that? Right? So, but, and also, this person running around circumcising kids or adults or whatever would be a horrible, horrible criminal. I mean, technically, it would be, because you're inserting into a sexual organ, it's technically rape on top of mutilation and amputation. And what, Ben is going to say that's not damaging? And even if you sanitize and say, well, a doctor does it and they give you an anesthetic, which they don't do for most children, or at least they didn't. I think this may be slowly changing. Probably don't do it at a bris, though. But whatever, that's not damaging. Of course it's damaging. It's removing healthy tissue. And the only reason that you don't see it as damaging is because of your anecdotal cultural bias, which you are flaunting here, and without any irony. And you would never, ever apply that same logic to female circumcision, to sex change. Look, you could say, look, this is just our culture. We like to sex change our kids at, every second child or whatever. He would never, ever accept that. But he accepts it here. And then, the crowd laugh. They're his fans, whatever. And this guy, maybe he's not the best exponent of this ideology, and it's certainly not the best venue for it. I'm not going to, there's not much else to say about that part. But, like, this is just so frustrating. And it kind of demonstrates the blindness here, where they can be so on point when it comes to sexual transition, where they can verbalize the principal problems with that so well, and then just let it completely go over. And there are differences in degree, I agree. If you were to ask me, when can somebody consent to a circumcision versus when can they consent to a sexual transition surgery, I think that they would both be among the last things that you can do. Like, you could consent to having a job, you could consent to signing a contract, you could consent to taking a loan, you could consent to dating somebody or to having sex before you could consent to a medical amputation like a circumcision, or and probably even after that would be a sex transition, or at least parts of sex transition. There's parts of, part of sex transition could just be wearing different clothes, and that's pretty reversible. That's not such a huge deal. But the hormones, the other surgeries. But it's funny that this surgery is not damaging. Of course it's damaging. Yes, you can still have children. Women who get circumcised can still have children. Women who have mastectomies can still have children. We can fucking gouge out your eyes or cut out your tongue, Ben. Right? Cut out your tongue. Like, it doesn't matter. I can still have sex with my wife. Yeah, you can. That doesn't mean you weren't damaged. It doesn't mean there was a horrible crime what happened to you. And I also think there's a bit of a red herring here. I would suspect that if the American Association of Pediatrics, the AAP, came out and said circumcision has no medical benefit, it's not medically justified, it should not be done, and the studies that support circumcision, I think, are all questionable and more or less debunked. But let's say that was not even a question, that there was no debate about it. Ben would still be in favor of circumcision. And if people could say it is actually damaging, it does actually cause harm, I think Ben would still be in favor of it. And the reason is because he's a religious Jew and he thinks God told him, or if he just believes the tradition is that strong. Maybe I assume he's believes in God, but it's possible that he doesn't, but just values the Jewish tradition so much that he'll act that way. But regardless, that they mandate circumcision, and so he's for circumcision. And even though he would not grant any other religion the right to amputate anything, even things more minuscule, right? The Muslims who want to give a ceremonial pinprick, and I'm not saying that all female circumcision is only that mild. There are forms of it that are as invasive as male circumcision and more invasive than male circumcision. There's also versions that are less, and he would be 100% against them. And the fact that they say that it's their religion, he doesn't give two fucks about. But his religion, look, I have Jewish friends who are uncircumcised. And one of them is never going to get circumcised, even though he speaks Hebrew and he has lived in Israel and he loves Israel. But he says, I am never getting circumcised because I love my foreskin. It's amazing. I have another friend who's Jewish who did get circumcised when he was 29. So his choice, right? He can do that. And if Ben's sons, if he raised them to be good Jews and they go to yeshiva school and blah, 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 and they read the Talmud and the Torah, and they decide when they're older, maybe not even 18, maybe 15, 16, 17, and they decide they want to get a circumcision, great. That's awesome. But for him to just go and just cut up their dicks and then say it's not damaging because they won't remember and they won't know any better. Again, you could rob your son too. Like, let's say your son inherited $1 million from a deceased relative, a grandparent. But of course, as a baby, they don't know that. So as a parent, you just say, I'm just going to take this money. So you have access. It's just given to you in trusteeship. And you just take it and you blow it all. And you never tell them. And they grow up and they're not sad. They're none the wiser that it happened. And so no harm, right? No crime. They don't know. What they don't know doesn't hurt them, right? Right? And yet taking $1 million would be trivial compared to cutting off part of your dick. And yet he would make the exact same argument here. So the cultural blindness here, I mean, it's possible that he knows all this and he's, because he's on stage. I kind of doubt it, though. I think he sincerely has no clue what he's talking about. Anyway, I couldn't watch that and not make a video comment about it. So let me know what you guys think and have a great day. Goodbye.